I'm here with the exceptional Mark Morris, who's the managing director and the co-creator of Prison Architect. Congratulations once again on the huge achievement that is Prison Architect.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. It was we never expected it to be quite as successful as it ended up being. So it's still, I'm still in a bit of shock, really.
Well, I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, actually. I mean, it's a massive independent gaming hit, inspiration to indies all over the world. Sold over 2.5 million units, am I right?
Yeah, about that is as crazy as it sounds. It's actually quite difficult to track how many units you sell after a certain number. So that's kind of the figure that we quote, probably with people that have downloaded it for free and stuff. Almost certainly over 3 million now, so it's an incredible number.
Oh, that's fantastic. And it's both hilarious and compelling at the same time. It's got major review scores in the high 80s and the 90s, and I believe it started out with over 16,000 players and over $600,000 generated within the first 2 months of the announcement of the campaign. Is that right?
The number that always stuck in my mind was we launched on Monday, Alpha 1, and by Wednesday we'd gone over $100,000. That was the figure. Within those 3 days, it was up to 100K. And that was the point that I thought, to put it into context, Introversion's biggest game before that was DEF CON, and that had sold like $250K worth, kind of through life, something like that. So the scale of Prison Architect from right at the beginning was completely different to anything else that we'd done before. So it was a hit from day one.
It's such a fabulous story, from the success of DEF CON, and then the disappointment of Darwinia and Multiwinia, and then the satisfaction and the creative joy and the financial reward of Prison Architect.
Yeah.
How do you feel about it all?
Well, I think that they're connected, actually. We, for those that don't know the background, Introversion was founded in 2001 by myself and 2 other guys from university, and that was way back before indie was a thing. So the fact that 4 guys were releasing games and selling them around the world, it's pre-Steam and all the rest of it, we were quite unusual. And during those early period, the first sort of 11 years of Introversion's life, it was very up and down. Some of the games were very successful, and then as you pointed out, Simon, with Darwinia and Multiwinia, we got trapped in a very long period of development, being driven to a certain standard that we weren't really set up as a studio to achieve. And by the time we'd got Darwinia Plus, it was an XBLA game out, the sort of rush of XBLA games that occurred, and we were kind of lost, and that was the end of it. But what that meant, and when I say the end of it, I mean we shut down the studio effectively. We got rid of all the staff there. I mean, I say all, we've never been huge, but maybe 3 or 4 programmers kind of working with us, and we owed quite a lot of money to quite a few different people, and we really genuinely thought this is the end of Introversion now. But because we owned the back catalogue, once we'd let all the staff go and the directors had gone and found other jobs and things, there was a dribble of money coming in through Steam for our back catalogue games, and that dribble of money was just enough to keep Chris and I engaged with the business. And at that point, Humble was just starting out, and we went over there and said, look guys, can we do a Humble Introversion bundle with you? And they were up for that. And I think that was the 2nd or 3rd sort of non-Humble indie bundle that they ran. And that gave us quite a large cash injection that meant that we could take the time to figure out what the next move should be and what the next step should be. And I think for the context of this presentation, there were 2 things. There was the game idea itself, which of course turned out to be a very, very good, compelling game idea. But more than that, from the business side, we decided, and we weren't the first, but we decided to really go in and embrace this idea of early access, of recognizing consumers, players, as also philanthropists, people that want to help you make your games. So we had a slight change of mind, which is that rather than treating people as players who want to just consume the content, there's enough people out there, for us anyway, with a bit of a history, who are willing to say, look guys, we trust you, we think that you might be able to make a decent game here, have some money to do it. And if enough people do that, then obviously you've got a viable project. So at that time, that was, none of this stuff sounds particularly new, but it was then. You know, Kickstarter was a new phenomenon. There'd only been a few games that had released in early access, and we really spent about a year, as well as developing Prison Architect, really sitting and scratching our heads and thinking, how do we make the most of this new approach to development? What do we do to benefit from this? And that's where the idea came from for Prison Architect's kind of monthly development cycle. And that was brilliant for the business and for the game as well.
Yes, really, you're one of the first developers to adopt a crowdfunding approach. How did you go about it? You decided to sort of launch your own campaign rather than risk being eclipsed by something big on the Kickstarter platform.
Yeah, well, Kickstarter asks you a few questions, and it still asks questions, and they're questions that we don't know the answer to. And I think there will be people who will talk to you about how to craft a good Kickstarter campaign, but fundamentally, I don't know how long to run one for. Do you run it for 6 weeks? Do you run it for 4 months? You know, there are pros and cons, and you can argue and you can look at successful campaigns, and I'm sure there'll be successful campaigns that have run for a week and successful campaigns that ran for long periods of time. So that was one problem. The second problem was, how much money do you want? The games industry is, or making games, the business of making games is inherently risky. You don't necessarily know at the beginning how long it's going to take to make a game. You know, it's like a standard industry joke that no games ever come in on time or to budget. Maybe some have, but in general, you take routes and you explore little areas that are either bear fruit or they don't bear fruit. And that's part of the joy of being a developer. And so for us, not knowing how much money to ask for because we didn't know how big the game was going to be, and not knowing how long to run a campaign for because we didn't know, as you point out, maybe something huge would come along and eclipse us, or who knows what would happen. Maybe there'd be some technology failure, or, you know, whatever. That led us to think, well, what does Kickstarter actually offer? Well, all it really is, in our view, was just sort of payment processing. You know, it sort of exposed you to a community of people who are interested in buying something, an idea, buying into a vision, buying into a dream. But we felt that we could probably reach that audience ourselves just through mainstream games media and YouTube and our own sort of resources. So we like the tiering ideas, the idea that different people have different amounts of disposable income and are interested in providing different amounts of support to the idea. So we like that idea. So we borrowed that, and we basically just recreated Kickstarter on our own website. Simple as that. I think, I can't remember exactly, 8 tiers, something like that. $30 was the cheapest. I think the most expensive was about $1,000. We limited the $1,000 tier to 5, and we sold 7 because we couldn't turn it off. By the time Chris had realised, or one of us had realised we'd sold 6, we tried to kill it, and then number 7 came in. So, you know, that was like $7,000 within, I don't know, probably like 20 minutes, you know, of us turning the campaign on.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And I don't think the world has changed, actually. I think that approach is still the right way to go about it, to do it yourself, do it through your own website, and then you've got control. Because Prison Architect, 3 million units, whatever it is now, that we were still developing Prison Architect. It took us sort of 5 or 6 years. Well, it's still in active development now. We did an update just before Christmas, and, you know, every now and again we return to it, and we put in some more bits and pieces. And we can do that because we know that there's an audience for Prison Architect. We know people are still coming to it in large numbers. And similarly, if it hadn't been as successful and we'd only been able to run for a year or so, Prison Architect, we still would have finished it. We would have delivered a prison simulation game, but it wouldn't have been as deep and as rich. So very much the alpha process or the early access process, I think, really helps you to cut your cloth. It really helps you to say, I found my audience for this particular niche. That's the way I look at it now. That it's all about exploring smaller and nicher audiences. Everything else, everything's been done now. So it's how do you build a management sim, or I don't know, a city builder or whatever, that has some quirk, some different feature that will appeal to you and gamers that are like you. And now there's enough gamers in the world for that audience to be big enough to sustain, kind of small teams. But you don't know how big that audience is until you've started selling your game. That's the only way of determining it. So I
how
think
did you
that this
drive your crowd to your site in the first place, though?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. We were really worried about bad press around Prison Architect. We knew it was full of bugs. We knew that there wasn't a whole lot of game in there at Alpha 1. And we actually didn't want, it sounds odd, but we didn't want to sell that many at that stage. It was really, give us a bit of money so that we can develop for a little bit longer. And the plan always was to drop the price and do a much bigger marketing campaign in the future. To just get the ball rolling, I think we sent emails off to about 4 members of the press. It was really, really small. Members of the press that we knew, people that we had a relationship with in the past, and that we thought they might be interested in this particular game. And we said, we're doing this. This is a bit of an experiment. If you could just put it as a news article or something, we would appreciate it. And that was all we needed to do to get that initial pick up and take off.
Wow, that's quite incredible. How did you, how to trust those particular journalists?
Well, we had a relationship with them. We'd worked with them all at, PC Gamer, the magazine back in the day when it was, the pretty much the biggest games media outlet available. So we'd worked with them over a period of time. So we built the relationships, and I think that is a very important part of press relations and how you get journalists on side in the modern era now, when journalists are, well, there are hundreds and hundreds of games being released every day across different platforms. So you really need to discriminate quite a lot about which journalist you're going to approach. What have they written before? What sort of games are they interested in? What sort of games do they play? By journalists, I guess I should be saying influencer. That's the modern language, isn't it? People on YouTube, whoever it is. So look for the ones that's what we did then, and that's what we would do now. Look for the ones who are most engaged in the similar sorts of things that we're touching on with whatever the project is, and then reach out to them directly.
What did you send to them? Did you send them like screenshots and a synopsis, or did you send them the build and say, ignore the bugs?
We'd made a trailer. So we'd made a 3-minute video that we hoped would explain everything about what we were trying to do. So it would explain about Prison Architect, what the idea for Prison Architect, the game was, the fact that it was full of bugs, the fact that this was an early alpha build and we were asking people to help us to develop and bring it up to scratch. So I can't honestly remember, because it was a long time ago that we sent that email out, but I would imagine that what we would have sent them is a link to that video so they could watch it, and a copy of the build. And that is what we would do nowadays. The difference then was that Steam didn't have early access, so everything was hosted from our site. Now I think it would be a link to the trailer and Steam key.
Thank you. At what point did you put it up on Steam then?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was really interesting. So we have a really strong relationship with Valve, and have done right from the start. They've been hugely supportive to us. Darwinia was the second non-Valve game on Steam. So we've always had a really good and very frank conversations with them. And interestingly, in the past, they'd been very price sensitive. So they'd always been putting pressure on us to kind of lower the prices for some of the games. And in hindsight, I think that advice was probably sensible. But at the time, I was a bit resistant to doing it. And 3 to 6 months into our alpha campaign, we had put our sales figures up on our website as well. We'd done that on purpose. So a bit like Minecraft, the idea being that we didn't want to be bragging about how much money we made. The thinking was, if people can see how many copies of this game we've sold, it will give them confidence when they arrive on this, random site on the internet. If they can see, 10,000 people have bought this, then they're more likely to jump in than, if no one's bought it. So, and journalists, I think we put out a few press releases about the volume that we were doing as well. So to try and drive a bit more interest as time was going on. So I think that's what directed Valve's attention to what we were doing. And they reached out to us and said, we'd love to take what you're doing and do that on Steam. Can we have a conversation? And I was terrified because we were at $29.99, which was a lot of money for a little indie game that wasn't finished. And
Yeah,
I was convinced that Valve were going to say, you need to be $4.99, or something like that. We want to do that. And so I was really worried about that and about what it was going to look like and all sorts of other things. And I remember going into dinner with them and I just kind of couldn't contain my nervousness. And I sort of said to them, look, why don't we just do everything that we've done on our site on Steam? That's my opening gambit, expecting them to say, well, yeah, but we were thinking more of something like this. But they just, Anna just looked at me and went, yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. We just want to take what you've done, maybe not the physical stuff, because we were shipping, physical bits and pieces. And they said, maybe not the physical, but everything digital, which for us was up to the $100 tier. And we just want to replicate it on Steam. And so, that was that. And we launched along with Kerbal is the one that I remember. Kerbal was where competitors, not really the right word in the game sector, I think, because I think we all, people don't just play a single game. But Kerbal were the ones that I was watching most closely to see what they were doing. It looked the closest sort of thing, the same building game, quite a cerebral sort of game, fairly regular updates and in early access on Steam. And there are a couple of others, but I forget what they were now.
Pretty clever of Steam as well, because they could see clearly it was too early to cannibalize that market.
Well, I think, I think that they're very evidence-based, Valve. So because they could see that we were selling however many units a day at a particular price point, there's no argument against it. They were like, that looks good to us, and you just crack on. And interesting, if you look at the difference between Prison Architect and Kerbal, obviously you can look at the sales figures and things on Steam Spy, and we've had a lot more aggressive discounting strategy than they have. So because this is a business audience, I would sort of advise people to do that. Have a look at our numbers, have a look at Kerbal's numbers, and bear in mind that we've dropped the price down to 75% off during the Steam sales over the, on a kind of sliding scale over the last, whatever it's been, 4 or 5 years. And Kerbal, I think to my knowledge, I haven't checked for a while, held at the full price. And it's just interesting. You can compare directly those two approaches and how they've affected the numbers. A bit of homework for your viewers.
What were the results of that? I mean,
they're about the same. Numbers aren't far off.
Right. Okay. Well.
Volumes aren't too far off. So it makes me question our approach, but I think I'm deliriously happy with how well we've done from Prison Architects. So I think sometimes you don't need to be greedy. It worked for us. Kerbal chose something differently. We do, like most people, we do most of our volume in the Steam sales over the year, and I wouldn't really want to jeopardize that.
Yeah, absolutely, and that they got the campaigns down now to a system, haven't they?
Mm-hmm.
It used to be that the press could really influence the success of the game. Do you think that's still the same case?
No, I really don't. I think that those days are gone, and I don't look back on them and wish they were still here. we were able to work within that system quite well, because we were the underdog. We would get lots of coverage, more than, well, the bigger companies would have to pay an awful lot for the kind of PR that we would get in the early days. So our success was very much based upon a world where that was true. And I don't think that is true anymore. There's many different media outlets. With Prison Architect, we found that suddenly we'd be sitting there and I get a sales report every day, and suddenly the sales report would have another 0 on the end. You know, it was a 10 times increase. And it took us a little while to figure out what was causing this sudden, massive 24-hour sales spike, or sometimes it might be a week or so. And we finally figured out that it was the YouTubers. You know, we were there when YouTubers suddenly started hitting these enormous audiences and having the ability to move a sales needle. So that was a revelation for us. You know, prior to that, it had all been, let's just go directly out to the press. We always had a very light touch to community. People always, you know, they talk a lot about Introversion's community, but I think that our community comes from a love of the games rather than, and some of the things we do. You know, we have done stuff to build a community, and we always give them tools, but we don't tend to engage very much. You know, so it's not particularly sort of hands-on. Yeah. So suddenly we had this emergence of YouTubers, and they really were, with Prison Architect, moving the needle. And that is where I concentrated our efforts for our game after Prison Architect, which was Scanasomba, and it completely didn't work. It completely failed. And the lesson I take from that I think we definitely were aware of it, was that different games perform in different ways on YouTube. And Scanner, which is a sort of narrative-driven single playthrough sort of experience, just doesn't play well on YouTube. Whereas Prison Architect, where the player kind of experiences their own creativity, every run is slightly different from the last one. That really does, and the humor in there, the darkness of it, all of those things kind of conspire to make it a perfect YouTube, and that was where we ended up. But we ended up with people making like enormous series of videos about PA, and we had quite long conversations about, should we pay them, should we reach out to them and say, hey guys, you're having a massive effect. But we kind of thought to ourselves, if somebody is doing something for the love of it, there's no better motivator than doing something for the love. Absolutely. And as soon as you move that away from, don't do it for the love, we'll pay you to do it, suddenly that relationship, that changes, and that whole relationship between the tuber and the game changes. And so we chose not to do that. But I need to be very open and honest. When we came to launch version 1 and version 2 of Prison Architect, we did pay YouTubers to do that, because we wanted there to be a couple of points in Prison Architect's time that were very clear. You know, so I was very worried that in years and years, people will be saying, oh, I didn't know you'd finished Prison Architect. I thought it was still in alpha. You know, so I wanted to have this big moment where the world knew that Prison Architect was at version 1. And to do that, we did reach out and pay some YouTubers to YouTube, not pay them to say they love the game. The way it works is you say there is some money for YouTube, and then the YouTubers themselves decide that they want to kind of claim into it. And I look at it as the money that we paid was about timing, you know. So then for that week in August or whenever it was, we had quite a lot of videos coming up. So we were trying to hit that kind of critical mass, you know, so that everybody would know that we were at V1.
Yeah. And so and for the right reasons, you know, to get those launch versions out. And also, I mean, that's the way that marketing budgets are spent now, isn't it?
Yeah, and I do think there are problems, and I think people are right to look at the motives of reviewers. You know, there's a trust issue that needs to be carefully managed. But I personally don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with somebody who has built up an audience of whatever 10 million people being paid to talk about certain things. I kind of think it's ridiculous if they're not paid, you know, because they're clearly talented broadcasters sitting there eating pot noodles, you know, when they're delivering tens of thousands of you know, players turning into hundreds of thousands of dollars to content creators. You know, to me, that balance doesn't quite seem fair.
Do you remember what budget you spent on that kind of thing?
Yeah, not much, because we're incredibly risk adverse with marketing budgets. I think V1 spent about $30,000 on it, something like that. There was a press tour, so we went out to the States, so that was probably, I don't know, 10K or something by the time you're taking into account flights and hotels and, you know, all the rest of it. So that whole thing was probably 50 in total, for probably 10 for assets. But we've always been very, very reticent to pay for placement of ads.
Yes, I remember, wasn't it TJ at Introversion used to say, don't pay for advertising, you know, get PR instead.
Mm-hmm. That was true then. I think it's harder now, because I think the PR doesn't, as we were discussing, doesn't have as much effect, you know. Yeah. But we definitely used to. That would be the way we would do it. I think the PR would be a lot more effective than the marketing spends, and we've done some work trying to track ads and ad spends and click throughs and all the rest of it. You know, all this sexy stuff that you can do on Facebook now, and we've never made a profit from it. And the advertiser's standard response is, well, that's the untrackable. You know, you've spent, and you know, you've tracked X amount, but you'll definitely be in profit. It's just that we can't track everything. It's impossible, you know, so you should be happy. And I look at it and I can smell bullshit, you know.
You mentioned earlier, you know, it's hard enough to track the sales.
Yeah.
Where does that fall over? Because you would hope, you know, in the digital domain, that you'd have unique codes, so you know.
And you kind of do, but then you start getting into things like, you have a humble bundle. You know, they'll tell you how many units you've got, but then you're getting refunds coming back off that. People are transferring codes from one person to another. All the different platforms that you look at have their own reporting systems that operate on slightly subtle and different time frames and things. So you could dedicate an enormous amount of your time to sitting there and trying to get a perfectly accurate unit count. I mean, a good example is if you do a physical unit, that they might make 10,000, 20,000 units. When do you say that game has been activated? You know, is it when it's sold? I think you know, another thing is, I think the sales figures that come back from all these people are correct and accurate, but there's always a bit of a timeline, like I say, with refunds, and knowing precisely how many units are out there is a difficult thing to. It's not worth the time it takes to track them down to the single unit.
Yeah. So just to say a little bit about development and the sort of community management, I remember you had an incredibly busy time, you know, serving the community up until, I think you said it was Minecon and then Christmas, and you and Chris sat down and said, we can't go at this pace.
Yeah.
Into a regular release timetable.
Yeah.
Monthly releases. That's still quite aggressive. It's like 3 weeks to make a meaty update. Was there a strategy for releasing so often?
Yeah. I never wanted to release on a monthly update. Right, I personally didn't want to do it. Because I was worried that we would. Yeah, I was worried that we would hit a problem and we wouldn't be able to get over it in the month, and that there would be aspects of Prison Architect that were not solvable within that month period, and we would also be damaging the game. So my view with Chris, and also a big part of my job, is to try and just keep Chris sane. You know, try and shift the pressure away from him. And so my view was, you know, don't worry about this. Don't worry about hitting a month. You know, it's good if we can, but let's not set a precedent of doing one every month. You know, let's make sure it's, you know, I wanted it to be swinging between sort of 4 weeks and 6 weeks, you know, that kind of time frame. But Chris felt, and he feels, and I think he's probably right, that the tempo, especially with, because we would make a YouTube video as well, Chris and I, to talk about the update that had gone in. And Chris felt that people would know in the back of their mind, there is an update, Prison Architect update coming this week. There's one due now. We wouldn't need to prompt them. It would just be because of the cycle, they would be knowing, well, we're getting to the end of February, there's going to be an update, and really actively looking out for the video and the updated build to drop. And I think he's right. I think that that structure certainly helped. And then over the years, it was a very helpful way of keeping very focused. And it turned out that actually we could do everything we wanted to do in a 3-week period. As the team slowly grew, we started being a bit canny. So the team, we had a few bug bashes in there, and a bug bash was basically when we would announce that we're not going to put in any new features this month. We're just going to polish and tidy up everything that we've done. And it served two purposes. Firstly, we polished and tidied up a lot of work. A lot of bugs got fixed. But Chris would not really be involved in the bug bash. So that would be led by a much more functional type of production where you could, Chris would triage the bug. Yeah, exactly. It's more QA. I mean, it's some of it where, is it a bug or is it a feature? And is the bug in the way in which this system works? So there were definitely, questions he needed to answer, but that he could come away from development for a bug bash and work on something that might take a couple of months to get in or something like that. But basically the structure meant that if a system was going to take longer than 3 weeks to develop and get in, the system had to be broken down into a smaller chunk. And I think that was an incredibly healthy way of managing kind of slippage. We chatted earlier about games always slipping. When you've got to get it out at the end of the month, as that the first week, even then you're being very tight on what you're hoping to do. By the end of the second week, you're really going to have to cull things. So a system like, you might have CCTV, and the CCTV system might have cameras that the player can place, wires that they can connect them up to a control system that needs to be manned by a guard. If a guard's not manning the system, then the game ignores what the CCTV cameras can see. Arcs that the cameras can see, whether the cameras move left and right, whether the cameras, when they're broken, continue to move left and right. All of these different things, are certain things visible on camera, like a murder or an attack, and other things invisible on camera, like a bit of drug abuse, the idea that the prisoner's kind of quietly doing it in the background. So that's what the full CCTV system looks like. But you can break that down, and that's exactly what we did, into much smaller chunks. So the first chunk might simply be, we're going to allow the player to just stamp in a camera, and when he stamps in the camera, that's going to be the equivalent of there being a guard in the room. So if anything bad happens in the room, an alarm goes off and any nearby guards will run in. And that might be all we could achieve, within that kind of 3-week period. But it would work, it would work. It would go into the game. Very importantly, we could see what the players made of it. We could watch the community. We could see them putting in, how are those cameras adjusting the architecture of the prisons? What's changing now because we've brought them in? Are they too powerful? And I think that was one of the reasons why we had to introduce the idea of a guard being at the viewing station, because if you just put the cameras in, the prisoners were under 24/7 surveillance. So the question we're thinking, well, that's not how the world works. Why is that? And the answer is because it's only surveillance if there's somebody watching that feed all the time. Otherwise, it's a record. You know, and so you watch the players, you understand how it affects their game experience, what they like about it, what they don't like about it, and then you can add on a new a new part of that. And equally, that development, that extension of that system can be given to somebody slightly lower down in the team. Because Chris is the one that said, I think we want cameras, but now I want you to only make the cameras work if there's a guard watching the screen. That's a lower level kind of game design task than thinking about how the entire camera system might unfold.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and the community gets to contribute to the game.
Yeah, yeah.
as well. Did you feel much extra pressure because you already had money from the loyal fan base? Did you feel extra pressure to complete the game on time and to get stuff out?
Well, we never told them when we were going to finish it. So time was never was never ever anything that we put ourselves under pressure from. We were very careful about what promises to make to the community and what pressure to put ourselves under. And I think this is the major downside of early access, that you need to know what your exit strategy is going to be. And Chris and I, before we launched it, we're talking through what our exit strategy would be. And it was basically, there's a number of players that need to come every month and buy it. And that's not that many when it was just me and Chris in the business, to make this sustainable in the long term. And I think we reckoned we could probably finish Prison Architect in about a year, So people think, well, it took you 8 months. How could you possibly say you could have finished it in a year? Well, it just would have been a much smaller game. It would have been a lot simpler. It wouldn't have had the richness. It still would have been a reasonable game. It still would have been a good experience and still worth the kind of $30 that people had paid. Yeah. But it wouldn't have been what it turned out to be. So because the cash kept coming in, we didn't have any guilt, because we knew the bigger challenge really was to try and stay focused on the game that we wanted to make and not get carried away because suddenly we've got a lot of cash coming in, not suddenly go, well, let's make it full 3D with, video motion capture and all sorts of other stuff, that was more the challenge. But once we'd spent about a year in the monthly cycles and we were starting to get that confidence that we could push something out every month, that was when the pressure really went, and it just became a lovely experience.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's so insightful to hear, how the relationship works with the community. So, and you talked about like suddenly have that cash. Was it? How did you sort of manage the long-term budget? You didn't get carried away, clearly. And was it tempting? Was it a bit like winning the lottery?
We've been through that boom and bust cycle in Introversion's past, and going through that in the past enabled us to develop financial controls within the business that are very, very tight. So we already knew how to run a business, a games business, sustainably. Because we'd learned that from the early days, and I'd sustained it for about 5 years on hardly any income, So with very tight controls, and we're quite slow to take all of the or any of the cash out personally. And there was a moment where we suddenly got to the point where we were happy with Prison Architect's development, happy with the size of the team, knew that it was resourced. If we didn't earn another penny, we'd still be resourced for 2 years. And there was a bit of cash on the top of that. And we all went out and bought cars. And that was the moment, I think, where we're kind of like, yeah, this is what all the hard work over 12 years or whatever it was for, so that I can finally drive this car.
You mentioned you did a deal with Humble Bundle. Did you do other deals with other providers?
GOG, Good Old Games. They were involved quite early on. I've learned over the years that almost every day, well, not quite every day, but every week, you'll get an email from somebody who's setting up the next best, online store. It's Steam, but it does this. I've heard it time and time again. And the tactic that I use, which I'm happy to share, is I listen to the marketing call. I listen to all the spiel. I listen to how great it's going to be and why it's going to change the world. And then I ask for a prediction on how many units that they're going to shift, because obviously, they're launching this amazing new store. And you'll get an overcooked number, of course, because they're trying to win the business. And then I look at that and I cut it in half and I say, advance me half of the money for half of those sales. And very, very quickly, people drop away, and you realize who's serious and who isn't. And that's been my general approach. So GOG sticks in my mind, Humble sticks in my mind, Steam, obviously. Obviously the consoles, they're kind of different world. But in terms of, I think we did a German retail deal. Those guys came through. Yeah, I'm probably forgetting some other major. We've just done a deal with EA.
Oh, with EA, wow. I mean, I'm more sort of interested in, for the sort of thinking from the perspective of a young indie or somebody trying.
Yeah, my advice is don't bother. It's not worth it. You're taking risk. You're losing time, right? Because you've got to wade through contracts. You can either not bother with legal and just have a crack yourself, which we certainly did in our early days, because you don't have a choice. You can't afford a lawyer, so you do your best to try and look through an agreement and see if there's anything in there which is obviously shocking. But this is all dead time to you. The reality is that in my view, Valve is where the action is, Steam is where the action is, and maybe this will change, because it certainly appears to be, almost like the top 1% now are doing like 99% of game sales, and everything else is just sort of falling away. So perhaps other stores will start kind of curating and maybe start picking some things up. GOG's good. Humble's definitely good. They've delivered and have been good people to work with.
Can we move on briefly to brand longevity?
Yeah.
I can see that there's lots of 3D content. There's a console version, iPad version. Can you tell me how you sort of orchestrated all that? Did you plan it yourself?
Yeah. So I think we could be criticised for not being massively joined up. There are different versions produced by different people, but we believe, having been burnt when we were working on Darwinia Plus, which was Darwinia and Multiwinia for Xbox Live Arcade, we realized that our skill as a studio is in creating and testing new IP, and we want to do that on Steam. That's where we want to work. We don't, the barriers to entry, even though they get smaller, they're still quite large, and there aren't that many levers you can pull after you've got a game on a console to try and boost the sales. You're kind of in Microsoft's hands, whereas Steam is just it's just a website. So there is things that you can do to drive those sales. So we very much want to be operating on PC, and we very much don't want to be operating in the console space. But for a game like Prison Architect with a lot of following, a solid console version is a good idea. It's a good thing to do. And we use an agent, and he flies around the world going to Gamescom and GDC and all the rest of it, and keeps his fingers on the pulse for the publishers who are looking for these kind of deals, and the developers who might be set up to do it. I used to do that role, but now I'm a bit older with a family and things, I tend to stay at home. So John Cook does that for us. So
right. I mean, a good agent can save you all sorts of contractual pitfalls as well, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, the deal that we do with John, I'm sure he won't mind saying, he just gets a cut. So John's interested in boosting, boosting the numbers that come in on the front end, and he's very good at listening to what my requirements are for a deal. And the way I look at it, when we did the console deal, we had sold whatever it was at that point, 1 million units on PC. So I just want to find someone else that thinks that they can sell that number on console, and I want them to take the risk. So I want a small amount of money up front, because there is an opportunity cost associated with this, and then they do the work, and both parties benefit from us. Both parties benefit from it.
That's great. So it's more like a licensing deal for you.
That's exactly what I want to do. Yeah. And find somebody that's and in Double 11, who did the Xbox and PlayStation 4 versions of PA. They just did a really, really good job. Their design team, I've never worked with anybody as competent and as diligent. They went through, I don't know how many interface screens there are in the game, maybe 1,000 or something, and they produced this wiring diagram of every single screen, how it interacted with every single other screen, the entire UI flow, plus mock-ups of what every one of the screens was going to look like. That was their design deliverable. And when that came through, we were just blown away. You know, we were like, yeah, these guys, they know exactly how big this game is because they're doing it properly. And all too often, there's a lot of people that say, yeah, we'll have a crack, you know, we'll do that. And they don't properly assess how big the game is. You know, we start at the beginning and just, and then they come back to you and say, oh, we didn't realize how big it was or how complicated it was. And it's like, well, hang on, you know, you saw the game at the start. There weren't any surprises. This is just bad assessment on your part. So that's how we look to operate. And we used Paradox to do the iPad version of Prison Architect, and that was a deal that we did based upon Paradox had expressed to us a desire to move into tablet, you know, and we looked at Prison Architect as PC strategy, and we look at their other titles, which we think there's a really good match between our audience and their audience. And I think that with iPad, the challenge is not necessarily development of it. The challenge is really managing that portfolio, really, you know, user acquisition, driving customers in, driving customers from one game to another game. I think there's a lot more publishing that needs to be done, I think, in the iPad and Android space. And Paradox looked like the best fit for that. But of course, now we've got 3 separate code bases that are all slightly out of sync. And, you know, if a player went from the console version to the iPad version, they would have a different experience. I'm not going to say better or worse, but it would be different. And you could say that, well, that is the downside of our approach, our sort of iterative approach of try it first, never really know when it's going to be finished, and then plug in other people, rather than sitting down with a top level design but of what it will look like on all platforms. But if you do that, it's much more heavyweight. And if you miss on PC because you've spent too much time, you know, you've not done the best interface on PC because you're thinking about how to make it work on console, you could hamstring yourself from the start. So I kind of think there are pros and cons to our approach, but I'm happy to sacrifice a bit of extra revenue, which we might have been able to get if we'd launched everything at the same time, with the freedom and flexibility to have been able to, you know, not know how long the game was going to take, you know, work on it for as long as the money was coming in, tweak it depending on what people were saying. You know, all that iterative development with our fans was a huge benefit.
Yeah, and you know, with the different platforms, of course, you've got a different way into the game, you know, via a touchscreen, for example. So you can see that the community will accept the differences within the different versions, right?
Yeah, and we haven't had any complaints. You know, we haven't had any complaints. Game. Yeah, just like, yeah. And I, you know, you look at it, and I think gamers are in stovepipes. You know, I think that if they play on PC, they don't want to play on tablet because they're. Yeah, I just think that's how it is. And if they play on console, they don't. Again, you know, they're not that interested in picking it up and playing on PC. They have their format. That's the format they're comfortable with, and that's how they want to engage. That's
right. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And have you got plans for to attract a new generation of Prison Architect players at all?
Yeah, well, it's kind of this is a business talk, so I can say it's a cash cow. You know, obviously it's not. It's a beautiful, wonderful game, but you know, from a purely financial perspective, it is the backbone to the company now, and so it serves a couple of purposes. It generates a lot of revenue, and we all like working on it still. We all like updating it still, and that is the way in which we are with sales. Well, sales have slowed last year, but we are moving on to new games, new ideas. That's what Introversion is. We're a creator of new things, and Prisoner. But sometimes you might not want the entire team working on, something brand new if it's not fully understood. So Prison Architect enables us to move some people back to the PA world, put another update into that, and then launch that update. So I think people will come to PA through YouTubers still making videos, through us, talking about it and making videos that we make and things. But there's no plan at the moment to sort of chuck a load of money into trying to get new people into it, because I'll be completely honest, Simon, I wouldn't have a clue where to spend it. I just don't know what works and what doesn't work. So at the moment, we're just, it is working. People are discovering it. People are playing it. People are still making YouTube videos about it. So I'm kind of in this luxurious position where I don't need to force that to happen.
Yeah, fantastic. And I suppose also the luxurious position allows you, as you said, to be thinking introversion. That's what they do. They come up with new ideas. Are you working on some new stuff now? Is there any?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not ready to talk about it just yet.
Right.
But yeah, we want to make a game that fits the early access model, just like Prison Architect did. So that's what we've been working on. A title that has that amenity to being updated on a monthly basis. Looks good in YouTube. But ultimately, this is how I think. I think about the marketing. If Chris was here, he'd be telling you that it's a game that's really good fun, and it's a topic that he wanted to explore for ages and ages. So it's a new move for us, but playing to our core skills that we've kind of learned and honed over the year. And it's going to be out later in 2018. We keep having massive arguments about when. I want it out early. He wants time to make it, but hopefully sometime around the summer.
Just one final question on that then. Does the success of Prison Architect colour the creative and design process for the new stuff you're doing? Always not as good as Prison Architect.
Yeah, well, Scanner Samba, which is the game we did after Prison Architect, was the biggest flop that Introversion has ever made in terms of sales. I think it's a good game, but no one else did. So any kind of thought that we might be able to translate that audience from Prison Architect to a new thing that's just because it's the next thing from us has been proven again that every game sells on its own merit. I like to think that Prison Architect was out of 6 games, it was our big hit. It took us 18 years, 6 games, and we had one, massive hit. That's good enough. That's good enough. And if I can get another Prison Architect in the next 18 years, that's good enough. So we try not to, we don't, that's not our aspiration. Our aspiration is to make a game that is really good, that is innovative, explores new areas that maybe other people haven't looked at in the past, and is enjoyed by a lot of people, and is a financial success. It doesn't need to be a storming financial success. It just needs to make a little bit more than it cost me to make it, because then it buys us time to move on to whatever the next idea is going to be. So, for us, when the twilight of my life finally closes in, hopefully in 50 or 60 years, I want to look back and just be proud of just an enormous collection of games. That's the goal, not really a bigger house or anything like that. I want the same core team to be able to just continue to ride whatever storm the industry throws at us, whatever the next set of changes is, and still make games that are entertaining and people want to play.
Always be able to look back and see that you've had this fabulous hit,
Yeah.
I like DEF CON myself.
Yeah. Well, this is it. I talk. The guys roll their eyes, but I talk about an iPad version of DEF CON. I talk about a console version of DEF CON because I don't think that game is a game of its time. I think now, especially now with everything that's going on in the world, it's completely relevant again. And that Absolutely. Was Chris's. One of the things that he did really well, that the graphics wouldn't be any different now to the graphics that we used in 2006. So it's not a game that you play and think, oh, this is really old fashioned. It's a game that has just as much meaning now as it did all those years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. If not more, as you said.
you know, so I'm all up for DEF CON 2018, but Chris wants to do new things.
If you're putting yourself in a young developer's shoes today, how would you go about funding a title? Using the Steam process?
Yeah, I'd make a game myself by working out in a supermarket, stacking shelves or whatever it was that I would do during the day, and I would make the game in the evening and the weekends. That is exactly how I would start now.
Yeah.
I absolutely would not look at trying to set up a company. I wouldn't really look at trying to tap into funds or anything like that. I would look at, you have to do this now as a complete commitment of passion, I think, to start off with. I think too many studios launch a good game, you know, they work hard on it and it's a good game, and it misses because it's their first game. So they're not known, they don't have any presence. And then they fold their company and that game just dissolves away.
Yeah.
Introversion, the reason we're still here is because we've always kept our old games and we've kept them all going. And that's why I was able to do a humble bundle and generate that money to kick it forward. And if game number, well, for us, Prison Architects, massive success. What's the effect been on the back catalogue? You know, we're still selling a couple of $100,000 worth of Uplink in a year or whatever. That's directly because of the success. Yeah, I know, exactly. And Uplink's 2001, right? Uplink's my favourite.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I do love Prison Architect, but
I'll have to have a go.
Yeah, Uplink's my favourite. There's a simplicity and a beauty to that game, I think. But too often, small developers, they move on, they've called themselves Banana Monkey or something, and they shut themselves down, and then they go and start up a new team and they call this something completely different. And that's not I don't think that's the right way to do it. You've got to expect to be failing, keep hold of that IP, you know, keep them in a way in which you're going to be able to exploit them going forward. Start making the connections with your first game. You know, maybe you've never been to GDC before, maybe you don't know any press, you know, but get over. Maybe that's all you can afford to do 1 year, you know, just go to GDC and meet some other indie developers who introduce you to the press guys. And in a few years' time, they might remember you because, oh yeah, I remember that game. That was cool. How did it do? Well, it didn't do very well at all. Well, okay, but you've got something new. So this business is, and because of Unity, it's becoming much easier to make games and launch games. So the proliferation of content is enormous, which is making it even harder to make money. So my advice very much is, don't give up the day job. Do it on your own or with your small team or whatever, in your evenings and your weekends. Put it out there and see how much it makes for you, and then do that again until you get somewhere where you get a bit of experience. You've maybe got some fans from your first 3 games or whatever it is. That might then suddenly start looking like you could become a company, you know, because you've got that experience and that knowledge.
Well, that's a great approach, Mark. And do you have any other advice or guidelines for developers?
Well, keep it small, you know, keep your ambition tight. All too often when I see pitches, it's for games that are huge, you know, are going to take forever and ever to make. If you don't know you can make this game in 6 months, it's too big. Because if you know you can make it in 6 months, it'll take you a year, you know, almost guaranteed. I like early access, you know, that's what I've been talking about. But I think early access works when you've got a proven track record. So if you're a company that people have learned to respect and they want to see more games, I think it's easier to convince people than if you're, you know, brand new saying, hello, I'm just this lad, give me some money. But once you've got a bit of a track record and you can point to them and say, look, I made this game, I launched them, I finished them, they're good, you know, then you might be able to get some people buying into your concept. But be wary of advice, I think I would say, just because nobody really knows what they're doing, because the industry changes so quickly. And I think often, sometimes people say, don't make a game for you. I think, well, that's the only kind of game you can make, you know, otherwise you're guessing. So make the game for you. Where do you learn about games? You know, if you learn about games on some new social network that I've not heard of because I'm 40, that's where you need to be marketing your games,
Yeah, yeah.
and disrupt. The industry is changing, media is changing, it's changing all the time, and by the time something has become accepted advice, it's 10 years out of date. So you've got to be agile and nimble and on your feet and trying things and failing and just keep on coding.
Thank you so much, Mark.
No problem, Simon.
Really fabulous.